Okay, we are honored to have a distinguished local guest like Joe Fahey here with us. Joe is a native of Strathmore, grew up on South Geddes Street, and graduated from Corcoran High School. He raised 2 daughters during their formative years on Robinow Road and later lived on Strathmore Drive. Joe is a judge in the New York State Unified System and has been an adjunct professor of law at Syracuse University College of Law. He also served on the Board of Education for the Syracuse City School District. But what you need to remember about Joe, first and foremost, is that he is an Irishman. He is a member of the American Conference of Irish Studies, the American Irish Historical Society, and the Irish American Cultural Institute. This interest in his Irish heritage inspired Judge Fahey to write a book about his uncle, James McGuire, who was Syracuse's youngest mayor and an Irish nationalist. He'll tell you about this important figure in Syracuse's history today. It is a great honor to have such an accomplished local speaker at our Strathmore neighborhood event, so please join me in welcoming Judge Joseph Fahey as our guest speaker.
Thank you very, very much, Mary Beth. It's good to be home. I grew up, as Mary Beth said, in the Strathmore section. I remember coming into this park and spending many, many summers here. I remember when this was a working firehouse, and it was a polling place, and it's turned into a beautiful, beautiful facility. I think I'm glad to see that the neighborhood is stable and thriving as it is, because it is a beautiful, beautiful section of Syracuse. Let me tell you a little bit about how the book came about, and then we'll talk about McGuire. And I probably do better in question and answer form sometimes. So if you have questions, that usually tells me what's on your mind, and I'm happy to stay and answer questions as long as possible after I've told you a little bit about him. The way the book came about was about 10 years ago. Some folks from the Irish American Cultural Institute here locally were going to put together an anthology of early Irish American leaders in Onondaga County. And they knew that I was, a descendant of McGuire's. He was my great uncle. And so they came to me and wanted to know if I would do a profile of him. So, and I mean, all of the information I had about McGuire at that time was anecdotal from my mother. And some of it wasn't accurate. I mean, she thought he was, in addition to being the youngest mayor of Syracuse, she also thought he was the first Irish Catholic mayor of Syracuse and the first Democratic mayor of Syracuse, and neither of those things were true. But I didn't learn that until I got into the research that I did. So I did the profile, and it came out to about 30 pages. And then they, of course, didn't do the anthology. So I had this article, and I sent it off as a possible topic for the Irish American Studies in New York, and I went down and was part of their annual program. And Jim McKillop from SU Press was in the audience, and at the end of it wanted to know if I would be willing to turn it into a biography, and not having any idea what was in front of me, I agreed, and spent the next 7 years researching and collecting material on McGuire's life, and then took another 2 years to do the biography. The task of chronicling James K. McGuire was really kind of daunting, because he left no diaries, no correspondence, no papers, or written memories of any sort behind. And as I got into his life and began to discover who he was, and especially his Irish independence activities at the end of his life, I think that was probably deliberate. I think he was involved in a lot of clandestine activities up through the Rising and the early Irish Independence War, and as a result, he kept much of his activities unchronicled and secret. All of my research came from the local history section of the public library, the records of the Onondaga Historical Association, City Hall archives, the American Irish Historical Society, National Archives, congressional hearings, and M. de Valera's papers in Dublin. SU Press, when I turned in the manuscript, was a little surprised and I think kind of alarmed that it was 900 pages long and contained pretty close to a day-by-day account of McGuire's years here as mayor of Syracuse. So one of the things I can do today, in addition to talking about the book and what's in the book, but I can share also with you some anecdotal glimpses I got of him from my parents that I wasn't really able to include in the book because I could never really conclusively document them, but they were always historically plausible, and they always had kind of the ring of truth to them. He was born in New York City on January 12th of 1868. His father, James McGuire, had been born in Enniskillen in Ulster and had emigrated to the United States as a teenager during the potato famine. His mother, Mary Jane Kennedy, was the youngest of 6 children born to John Kennedy, a farmer in St. Johnsville in Montgomery County. Now, I don't know how or where they met, but they were married in New York City in 1864 when she was 19 and he was 21. He was a shoemaker who worked for Burton Company, a very high-end manufacturer on Park Row in Lower Manhattan, and he was a member of the St. Crispin Society, which was the shoemakers' union at that time. And following a pretty violent strike against Burton Company, they relocated here to Syracuse. They moved to Syracuse in 1870, 2 years after James was born, and he took a position with Gray Brothers, a shoe manufacturer that was located on the corner of Franklin and Walton Street in what's now called the Armory section of Syracuse. Syracuse was growing rapidly and thriving at that time, and I've devoted a chapter in the book that describes it during the period that it was, and I think you'll be fascinated by the rate of growth and also the number of different newspapers and businesses and manufacturers that they had here at the time. In the book, you'll find an account of a strike he led against his employers, Gray Brothers, which had what we would call gender issues and income equality issues today. In 1871, my grandfather, Charles McGuire, was born, and he was followed by John F., who was known as Frankie in 1873, George H. in 1877, Edward in 1880, their younger sister Mary Elizabeth was born in 1883, and Rosalind, the last of the children, was born in 1902. Now, someone in the family was a devoted Fenian. And my guess is there's somebody out there who's asking, what's a Fenian? And I know that because my wife Terry asked me that very question when I made the same statement to her. A Fenian is a follower or a member of the organization known as the Fenian Brotherhood. And that was formed in New York City in 1856 and was dedicated to overthrowing England and establishing an Irish Republic. And the organization took its name from ancient Irish warriors. Now, I say that someone, probably James, was a Fenian because George was named George Henry Moore after an Irish member of Britain's Parliament and founder of the Catholic Defence Association and the first leader of the Independent Irish Party. And Edward was given the middle name Sarsfield after Patrick Sarsfield, an Irish soldier who distinguished himself fighting against William of Orange on the side of the Catholic King James II. Now, during the period that James K. went to schools on the north side, he went to a number of schools formed by the Lutheran Church, and they were taught in German. And he became very fluent in German, which became an interesting quality when he began to campaign for citywide office across the city of Syracuse. And Syracuse at that time had a very, very sizable German population, and McGuire could campaign with them in their native tongue. You'll also discover how it influenced him in some other activities that he got involved in later in life. In 1881, tragedy struck the family. Frankie, who was age 8, drowned in the Oswego Canal, which ran along Lock Street, which is now called State Street. And my great-grandfather never, ever recovered from the loss. And at that point, my grandfather and James K., who were in their early teens, had to leave CBA and go to work to support the family. And they both found employment with various small businesses in Syracuse and worked to support the remainder of the family. Their mother was not willing to have their education end there. She took it upon herself to teach them, insisting that they read the classics and other great books. And James K. in particular became enamored with the classics and developed an interest in current events of that day and the political issues of the day. The following year, he became the youngest delegate to the Democratic National Convention, where he made some very powerful enemies who would exercise some great influence in thwarting some of his future political ambitions. When Grover Cleveland was nominated for president, James K. went on to stump in what they call the Western states, Ohio and Illinois, making campaign speeches for him. And according to family lore, he was heard on the stump one day by Republican Party boss Mark Hanna, who advised him to return home and to run for office. In fact, he was already viewed as an attractive candidate for office by the local Democratic Party, which had nominated him for several public offices before he was 21 years old and either able to vote or serve. He declined every nomination during this period, and he also refused a foreign consular position offered by President Cleveland, who was grateful for his efforts during the campaign. Instead of taking the consular position, McGuire remained with the firm Bradford Kennedy & Sons, which sold hardware. He'd been with the firm for almost a decade, and he worked his way up from stock clerk to head cashier to partner. My grandfather, Charles McGuire, started a very successful insurance agency at the age of 19. That same year, he and my grandfather and a number of other members of the Irish community founded the Catholic Sun. James was director and secretary-treasurer of the company and a frequent contributor to its pages. He was extremely active as a speaker, drawing standing room-only crowds in Skaneateles and other locales to talk about the Irish question on St. Patrick's Day and other local issues. And along the way, he formed his own political society. My paternal grandfather, Joe Fahey, said that when they proposed forming a men's club in St. Anthony's Parish on the south side, the pastor vetoed the idea because he said McGuire would simply use it as a springboard for his political ambitions. He was 27 years old. He was a 27-year-old upstart when he ran for mayor in 1895. The local Democratic Party was controlled by W.B. Kirk, the former mayor, whom McGuire had done battle with at the Democratic convention that nominated Grover Cleveland for president. On the night of his nomination, the New York Times hailed it as a great victory for reform over the Kirk machine. The Republican Party was badly split that year between a faction led by Congressman James Belden and one led by Republican Party boss and former Mayor Francis Hendricks, who was aligned with U.S. Senator Frank Hiscock. The Hendricks-Hiscock faction nominated Charles Saul to run on the Republican line, and the Belden faction broke away and formed a Citizens Reform ticket headed by Charles Baldwin. On election night, he defeated Baldwin and Saul, who finished second and third in that order. He was the youngest mayor of a major American city. His first term had a number of highs and lows. Despite having a majority of Democrats on the council, it blocked almost every initiative of McGuire's. McGuire believed that any company which received a franchise from the city should share some of its revenues with the city. Kind of an interesting concept that we might want to think about revisiting today. He got almost none of his program passed. He vetoed 60 measures passed by the council, and they overrode 40 of them. The high point of his first term was marrying Frances McGuire of Forestport, New York, on June 24, 1896. And although they had the same name and their families came from the same area in Ireland, they weren't related. She was 18 when she became the First Lady of Syracuse. McGuire went into his first re-election campaign without opposition in his own party, but this time he faced a united Republican Party. The campaigns were very brief. They were sometimes no more than 2 weeks long. They were conducted largely through the newspapers, and there was, I think, 12 or 13 newspapers in Syracuse at the time, coming out multiple times each day. And you'll find the accounts of the campaign in the book were pretty different than what you see today, and I would say probably a lot more honest in terms of their discussion and dialogue of issues. Now, they weren't without their scandals. Instead of drunk driving type episodes, you'll find an incident involving a horse, a wagon, and the canal in the book that happened during his first re-election campaign. That's actually pretty interesting. During his second term, McGuire became a candidate for governor. The Democratic State Convention was held in Syracuse, and he and his supporters pushed pretty hard for his nomination. In the end, his old political adversaries prevented his nomination. And you'll discover in the book that if they had not, the outcome of that race might have changed the course of American history quite dramatically. In 1899, the local Republican Party ran a true heavyweight against McGuire, former New York State Attorney General Theodore Hancock. Hancock held the record for the largest vote plurality in the city of Syracuse during his last run for Attorney General. And this campaign went beyond populism. It took on all the characteristics of class warfare, as McGuire portrayed Hancock as an out-of-touch elitist blue blood. He apparently succeeded because he defeated Hancock in that election. At this point, the Republican leaders, both at the state and level locally, wanted to eliminate him as an opponent, a future opponent, and as mayor. So they obtained a special prosecutor to investigate him. I think that might have been the forerunner of the Andreoli probe, for those of you who remember the Andreoli probe. And you'll find a lot of similarities to that probe and the Andreoli probe in this book. During his last term, he succeeded in persuading Andrew Carnegie to donate funds for the construction of the Central Library that's downtown on Columbus Circle. He also committed the city to support the creation of the Everson Art Museum, and against his better instincts, he decided to seek a fourth term as mayor. The Republicans nominated Jay Klein, the district attorney, and the ugliest campaign of McGuire's career was underway. On election night, Klein won by 1,425 votes, and the era of the boy mayor was over. As mayor, he had built 38 of the city's 40 schools, the city-owned golf course in Burnett Park. He'd persuaded Carnegie to donate funds for the new Central Library. He'd supported the creation of the Everson Art Museum, and he'd paved South Salina Street and a number of other city streets. He would be the last Democratic mayor for almost 50 years. The Republican Party leaders were so concerned that he would make a comeback that they tried to erase every trace of his administration. There were not, and there are not, any public buildings, parks, streets, or schools named after him, even though they would name one elementary school after the Republican Commissioner of Jurors. On a personal level, he and my grandfather had managed to put their younger siblings, Edward and Elizabeth, through Notre Dame University and St. Mary's, its sister college. Edward would go on to become a prominent sports writer and Elizabeth a school teacher. It wasn't a bad record for two Irish kids who had to leave school in junior high. The following year, he went back to the private sector, joining his brothers in the insurance business and publishing the Catholic Sun. In time, he became a lobbyist for Barber Asphalt, an Auburn, New York business, and at the same time, he kept his hand in local, state, and national politics. At the state level, he served as chairman of the State Democratic Party Executive Committee and coordinated all of the presidential and state election campaigns. He went to various Democratic national conventions and developed a very, very close friendship with William Jennings Bryan. At one point, he was being promoted for national office, and I'll let you discover the outcome of that for yourselves. He also became a principal supporter of William Randolph Hearst in his 1906 run for governor. The account of the Hearst campaign is a fascinating glimpse of the seemingly inconsistent sides of McGuire, one part reformer and one part power broker. Like all Irishmen, McGuire liked to keep up with his feuds. One such feud he had that existed for years was Syracuse University Chancellor James Day, who was critical of McGuire, Bryan, and Hearst in that order. And I think you'll find some of the exchanges they had in their correspondence that I was able to find pretty humorous. From 1905 to 1910, he spent the winters moving his family to New York City and New Rochelle because his business offices were now located in New York City and Philadelphia. In 1910, he made the break complete, and the family moved permanently to New Rochelle, and he ceased all political involvement in local politics in Syracuse. The next major event that occurred in his life occurred in 1913. He was indicted for a misdemeanor crime. Are you ready for this one? Soliciting a contribution for a political party from a corporation doing business in the state of New York. Now, if you had that law in the books today, not only would you not need any Moreland commissions, but probably the entire state government would be in jail. The New York County District Attorney, Charles Whitman, had a warrant issued for his arrest and staked out his house in New Rochelle. And you'll find a hilarious account of the search for James K. McGuire to arrest him during his business travels through South America and Puerto Rico. On December the 8th, 1913, he surrendered in New York State Supreme Court in Manhattan, where he pled not guilty and was released on bond. And the photo on the cover of the book was taken while he was surrendering in the district attorney's office. He looks very, very worried, doesn't he? Yeah. While he was under indictment, he refrained from his usual political activity and turned his attention exclusively to Irish independence. He was a high-ranking official of Clanna Gael, a very secret organization of successful Irish-American leaders drawn from the business and political sector. The organization's purpose was to lend whatever aid it could to the Irish Republican Brotherhood, which was the forerunner of the modern Irish Republican Army. As war broke out between Germany and England, the Irish independence movement and Clanna Gael in the United States went to full throttle in trying to influence the Wilson administration to either stay out of the war or side with Germany. And McGuire was in the forefront of all of these efforts. His first book, The King, the Kaiser, and Irish Freedom, was published in 1914, and it's a bitter critique of how Britain has historically exploited and mismanaged Ireland's economy. The following year, he published What Could Germany Do for Ireland? And in this work, he continued his assault on Britain for its treatment of the Irish, condemned British conscription of the Irish going on at the time, and made it clear that he believed that Ireland would best be served by Britain's defeat. According to my mother, Frances thought the book bordered on treason, and at one point considered burning the manuscript. Fortunately, she didn't. Once the United States entered the war, the book was one of many that was banned from the mails and prohibited on American military installations. His efforts were not limited to writing. During that same period, he engaged in a number of clandestine activities on behalf of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, which could have ended in a long jail term if he'd been caught at those, and those are recounted in the book also. The activity on the part of the Irish American leadership at this time was so anti-British that former President Theodore Roosevelt advocated interning all of them until the war was over. In March 1916, an organization called the Friends of Irish Freedom was formed. Its purpose was to raise money to advance the cause of Irish independence and influence the Wilson administration to support Irish independence. 15 of its 17-member executive committee were members of Clanna Gael, and McGuire was chairman. In America, he joined with John Devoy, Joseph McGarity, and New York State Supreme Court Justice Daniel Cohalan in public relations and lobbying efforts to keep America out of World War I. Kind of an interesting feature of the leadership in American Irish community at this time were the number of judges who held different offices and got involved in these political issues of the day, something that would never be tolerated today. McGuire was one of the emissaries that was sent to the White House to lobby Wilson for Irish independence. In April 1917, America declared war on Germany, and McGuire ceased his anti-British, pro-German advocacy, but did turn his full attention to the cause of Irish independence. On November 11, 1918, World War I ended, and with the end of the war, Wilson decided to take his revenge on the Irish-American leadership that had caused him so much difficulty. He sent Bruce Bielowski, the chief of the Justice Department's Bureau of Investigation, which was the forerunner of the FBI, to testify about collaboration between Irish-American leaders and the German government in spreading anti-British propaganda in the run-up to the war. And among those mentioned prominently in the congressional hearings was McGuire. Bielowski had McGuire thoroughly investigated and came very close to having him prosecuted. And you'll find an account of the investigation in the book, and the local personalities involved make it kind of interesting reading. On February 13, 1919, Michael Collins and Harry Boland broke Eamon de Valera out of jail in England. After a short stay in Ireland, de Valera, disguised as a merchant seaman, made his way to New York and slipped into the country on June 11, 1919. He stayed underground, avoiding detection by the United States government until June 23rd, when he held a news conference in New York. And among the places he stayed during this underground period was with McGuire in New Rochelle. De Valera confirmed this visit in a meeting he had with my mother in Dublin in 1974, and she said that my grandfather feared that if de Valera was discovered in New Rochelle, James Kay would be stripped of his American citizenship. With the end of the war, the Irish-American leadership turned its attention to securing recognition of the Republic of Ireland at the Peace Conference in Versailles, where Wilson was trying to establish the League of Nations. Once the Irish and the Irish-American leadership realized that Ireland would not be included in the League or even given a hearing, they turned their attentions to defeating the ratification of the League of Nations in Congress, and McGuire was a key player in all of that. While the League of Nations treaty was ultimately defeated, a split occurred in the Irish-American leadership, and the efforts of this group to work together was fatally crippled. In the clash between de Valera and the Irish-American leaders, McGuire tried to play the role of peacemaker. He met repeatedly with both sides, trying to get them to iron out their differences, to no avail. His efforts in attempting reconciliation between these two factions are also chronicled in the book. He wouldn't live to see peace or freedom come to Ireland either. On June 29, 1923, he suffered a heart attack in his hotel room in Washington, D.C., and was found dead the next morning. He was 55 years old. He's buried in the family plot in St. Agnes Cemetery on South Ave. He always wore the title of Boy Mayor with a certain sense of bemusement, as reflected in a note that he penned to the Syracuse Herald after they erroneously reported he turned 38 on his 37th birthday. Quote, 37 today, not 38. Getting old fast enough without you tacking on another year. Was 16 when nominated for school commissioner and 19 when nominated for member of the assembly, 27 when nominated for mayor, a boy wonder. Now 37 and a dead bird. I've tried to capture an era in Syracuse that we'll never see again, as well as one of its most colorful and I think unremembered leaders. He was quite a character, he led quite a life, and I hope that you'll enjoy the account of his life, and I appreciate your coming out today. Thank you. Anybody have any questions they have or anything I can answer about him or that era? Yes, Dick.
Joe, with what you've discovered and the fact that there's no memorial to him in the city, we have Democrats well entrenched in city government. Is there any thought of naming something after him or writing a...
I have not heard any movement in that direction. I know that the AOH has created like a memorial walkway where they put up different signs and plaques about people who've had significant history in Ireland. And I think they're going to unveil a plaque in front of City Hall about for McGuire sometime later this year, but I don't have the date of that. But that's the only thing I've heard thus far that would renew that.
Does Coleman have your book? Maybe.
I think Peter probably does have it.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
How does it make you feel to be related to such a wise man?
I found learning about him fascinating, and learning about Syracuse fascinating. I mean, I'll tell you one story about. We always had this impression that the McGuires came from Athlone, halfway between Galway and Dublin, and we would all go over to Ireland on our various visits, and we'd all make a pilgrimage to Athlone, and we'd all light a candle in the cathedral, and we would all drink a pint in the bar next door to it, and then we would go south to Knockavilla, where the Faheys are from, and I mean that's like a four-way stop sign with a bar and a church in the middle of it, like everything else. But we would all go to Athlone, and so I'm researching my great-great-grandfather, and I have to tell you, if you're ever doing any Irish genealogical research here in Syracuse, a great source is the Catholic Sun. The Catholic Sun ran obituaries of the Irish Americans who died here that the more mainstream Protestant papers wouldn't run. So I happened to come across my great-grandfather's obituary in the Catholic Sun. And I'm reading it, and it says he was born in Enniskillen, Northern Ireland. So my mother was passed on at that point, but I started calling all my siblings, and I'd say to them, hey, where does Mom's family come from in Ireland? Oh, they all come from Athlone. Everybody knows they come from Athlone. We all go to Athlone. I said, well, I don't know how to tell you this. I said, but I just read our great-grandfather's obituary in the Catholic Sun, and they said he's from Enniskillen in Northern Ireland. And my sister Jane, well, maybe it's wrong. I said, you don't think they knew where the guy was from when he died? You know. So that's my next pilgrimage is if I have to go back to Ireland, the next place I have to go is Enniskillen and see where the McGuires did come from. But it was fascinating. It was fascinating learning about him and fascinating really learning about the politics of Syracuse back at that time.
As you grew up, was there a lot of talk about the Irish causes and the Irish relatives?
Not so much in my house growing up. My mother was James K. McGuire's biggest fan. I mean, she just took such great pride in being related to him. So there would always be some talk about him in the house, especially as political times came around. His nephew Art McGuire ran for mayor against Bill Walsh in 1961. So there was some political activity by that family on that side. But it was a fascinating learning experience about him and some of the things that he did.
Joe, what was the battle between him and Syracuse about?
Syracuse University?
Yes.
Chancellor Day at that time, was part of the Republican Party hierarchy. There weren't all the lines were blurred when it came to Republican power politics in Syracuse at the time. So Day was a very, very conservative human being, and Day was forever critical of McGuire all during. And Chancellor Day would endorse his opponents when McGuire was running for re-election, and McGuire would in turn dig through his correspondence and come up with some letter from Chancellor Day requesting some assistance on something, and then he'd publish it. And so the two of them and Chancellor Day would say, that was very unfair of you to dig out my correspondence asking for favors at a time when I'm endorsing your opponent. But it went on forever. There is at one point McGuire is on a train from New Mexico to New Orleans, and he reads about some interview Chancellor Day has given where he's critical of William Jennings Bryan and McGuire, and McGuire pens this response to it that if you'll find it in the book, it's hilarious, his critique of Chancellor Day. But they had a lifelong feud between the two of them, and McGuire, he didn't let go easily and he was not, even though he only had basically a grade school education, he was not intimidated intellectually or by anybody. He was very, very confident in who he was, and Chancellor Day, being Chancellor of Syracuse University, just didn't bother him in the slightest if they were going to be at odds with one another.
You said he never went to college?
No, he never went beyond I think 8th grade. In fact, one of the things I got a big kick out of was I was living next door to Kevin Harrigan when I was doing the research, and CBA celebrated its 100th anniversary when?
It was founded in 1900. The brothers were here before that.
The brothers were here before that. And I said, so I was living next door to Kevin when CBA was celebrating its 100th anniversary, and I said, Kevin, I hate to tell you this, but CBA is a lot older than 100 years old. And he said, no, it wasn't. I said, yes, it was. I said they were teaching on the 3rd floor of St. John the Evangelist's elementary school.
You have it in your book.
Yeah, and then they had to leave for some reason, and then they came back. But yeah, he and
corner to St. John the Evangelist too.
Yeah, they did. That's exactly where they built. My grandfather, he told a story about going to CBA as a kid, and he showed up at school, and he was probably in 7th or 8th grade, and he had a big wad of chewing tobacco in his mouth. And the brother said to him, what are you chewing? And he said, nothing, brother. He said, then swallow. And he said he was so sick, he never ever went near a wad of chewing tobacco again after that. Anybody else?
What do you think that McGuire would think of today's politics and where Syracuse is, where they are now?
That's a good question, Betty. He was a real study in contrasts. On the one hand, he staked out economic positions, nationalizing the coal mines, things like that drove the national leadership of the Democratic Party to total distraction because they thought he was almost a socialist. And he considered himself a radical on the national level. At the same time, he was a major player. He contributed to all the political campaigns and picked all the candidates locally and stuff. I think, it's hard to say what he would think of Syracuse today. It really is. I think given his focus on having built 38 of the city's 40 schools during the 6 years that he was mayor, I got to believe that the school system would be a huge factor in whatever activities he was going to take part as mayor today. Clearly, Bob Condren and the pyramid companies would not have gotten that tax break. I mean, not without a hefty percentage of Carousel Mall going back to the city. So he in that score he had some pretty firm ideas about what ought to take place. But I mean, he left Syracuse in very, very good shape, and you kind of wish somebody, yeah.
We need leadership.
What was his relationship with some of the big economic players like the railroads and probably steel nearby and so on?
He well, with the railroads, like the telephone companies and so on, if they were going to put down tracks through the city of Syracuse, they had to pay a fee to the city for doing it. Same thing with the telegraph lines and the communications of the day. All through his term as mayor, there's a fight over what they call subways. And at first glance, you'd think he was going to build a subway system. He wasn't going to build a subway system. The subways were the lines that ran under the streets that carried all of the electrical devices. I mean, he had an ongoing feud with Syracuse Transit Company that was running the trolley lines through Syracuse, and they wouldn't pay what he wanted them to pay, and he got a neighborhood group on the north side so worked up one night that they tore up the subway tracks so that it couldn't run. And then, of course, the district attorney's office wanted to indict McGuire for inciting him, and the newspapers condemned him for doing it, and he just blew it off. He didn't care in the slightest. So he was a hard bargainer for the citizens of Syracuse. Patty?
The Erie Canal, is there any record of his, I don't know if it was still...
That was pretty much completed by the time they were here. What was interesting about it was the number of related canals that ran off of it. I mean, Lock Street was Lock Street because there was a canal that ran north and south that intersected with the Erie Canal, which is what my other great uncle drowned in. So, I was tracing the route when they first moved here to Syracuse in 1870. They lived on the corner of Butternut Street and North Salina Street, and he had to walk to work to the corner of Walton and Franklin Street, where Gray Brothers was located, and you'd have to cross a bridge every day, two ways, because the canal bisected the city of Syracuse, and that was the line by which they basically divided the city politically too. The north side of the city, which was heavily Irish, heavily German, and then became heavily Italian, was primarily considered the Democratic side of the city. South of the canal was heavily Republican. But the development at that time, I remember my father telling me that development in the city when he was growing up had essentially stopped at Brighton Avenue. So you didn't have that large swath of the valley and south of Seneca Turnpike that now exists in the city. So the canal was, it was a major... It was just a major factor in life in Syracuse, both in terms of getting to and from work and the way the city was divided up politically.
And were the railroads downtown at that time?
Yes. In fact, they had the trolley lines were very well developed. They had a trolley line that ran from downtown Syracuse to Skaneateles, and the night before he announced his candidacy for a fourth term, he didn't want to run, and his wife was death on his running. She did not want him to run at all, and he got drafted basically at the Democratic City Convention and nominated for a fourth term. And he said, I can't accept this until I go home and talk with my wife. And they happened to be summering out on Skaneateles Lake, so he took the trolley from City Hall out to Skaneateles. Some reporter followed him out there and managed to sit in the kitchen and listen to this discussion between Francis and James Kay, and eventually she relented and said he could run for a fourth term, and he probably shouldn't have because he got defeated. There was probably a little bit of what you would call McGuire fatigue at that time.
It's interesting.
Was it with bitterness that he moved to New Rochelle?
Oh no! He actually he took his defeat in good grace, and I think he was probably relieved at it because one of the things he needed to do was make money. I forgot what the job paid. The first three terms it was a weak mayor form of government, so he was not a full-time mayor, and so he wasn't paid on a full-time basis. He would have been. Maybe I might be wrong about that. It might have been the first two terms. The third term, he was what they call a strong mayor form of government, in which he had a lot more authority. But it didn't pay much at the time, and he had a healthy imagination when it came to business interests. I mean, he was a terrific lobbyist. They had a very successful insurance industry. At one point, he and a bunch of other investors formed a company to build some sort of construction machinery out in Chicago that they were going to relocate to New York. In the end, he moved to New Rochelle, and I think when he died, they were living in Manhattan. But they had a construction company that he and his son did that built a substantial portion of Duke University, and they also built a lot of construction projects across in Cuba, in Mexico, and across Central America. So he really was he was always going to stay somewhat involved in politics, but it was not going to play a major role the way it had previously.
I also wonder if you know what the population of the city was at the time of his term.
Off the top of my head, I don't recall it, but I know I've discussed it in here, the way Syracuse grew. I think it was approaching maybe 80,000. I could be wrong on that, though, but it seemed to grow by leaps and bounds with each census beginning around 1870 onward. Well, thank you very, very much. It was a pleasure.
Joe, is this going to be on C-SPAN?
Pardon?
Is this going to be on C-SPAN?
I wouldn't mind it.
Okay, thank you, Joe Fahey, for joining us today. We're very grateful that you took the time to share your work and stories with us. I'd like to remind you that you can sign up to join our listserv at the door. You can also sign up to volunteer at future lectures or leave suggestions for future speakers or topics. Our next speaker will be Sean Kirst, a local columnist for the Post-Standard on Sunday, October 18th at 7 p.m. His topic is titled Syracuse, What I Loved, Why I Stayed, and What Still Drives Me Wild. We hope you'll join us then, and thank you for coming.